The main street of Caldwell, Kansas, had not seen a silence like this since the day they buried old Hector Brine with a bullet still lodged in his chest, and nobody willing to claim responsibility. But that Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, every soul on every porch, every man leaning against every post, every woman peering through every dusty window, went stone still the moment Marshal Samuel McCrae rode down the center of Main Street with Sallie Talbot sitting straight and proud on the horse beside him. Not behind him, not trailing at a respectful distance, beside him. Her dark hair was pinned up under a straw bonnet that had seen better days, her calico dress mended at the hem but held with dignity. She sat her borrowed chestnut mare the way a woman sits who has learned that how you carry yourself is the only armor the world cannot take from you. Her chin was level. Her eyes swept the street like she was cataloging every face, every sneer, every opened mouth that thought better of itself before a single syllable escaped. Samuel McCrae rode with his badge catching the morning sun, and his jaw set like a man who has already decided every argument he is willing to have today, and has found he is not willing to have a single one. His dark eyes moved slow and deliberate from one side of the street to the other, and there was something in that gaze that was not quite anger and not quite warning, but lived in the exact space between the two where sensible men chose silence. His hand did not rest on his Colt. It did not need to. The stillness of that hand said more than the draw ever could. Jonas Priestley, who owned the feed store and whose opinions on social arrangements were both loud and frequent, opened his mouth on the board sidewalk outside his establishment. His wife, possessing more survival instinct than he had ever been credited with providing her, put her hand on his arm. He closed his mouth. The telegraph operator, a thin young man named Denny Alcott, who was new enough to Caldwell to still be surprised by things, pressed his nose against his window glass and breathed fog onto it, and thought that he was witnessing something he would describe in letters home for years. Sallie Talbot looked straight ahead and did not smile and did not flinch, and did not let the weight of every eye in Caldwell, Kansas, bend her spine a single degree. This was what 2 weeks of the worst and best days of her life had built toward, this moment, this street. This man riding beside her, who had started as a stranger and a complication, and had somewhere in the terrifying middle of everything become the only person she trusted with her life, and more dangerously, with the truth of who she actually was. But to understand how Sallie Talbot came to ride down Main Street in Caldwell, beside the fiercest Marshal in the Kansas Territory, you have to go back to the night she stepped off a westbound train with a forged letter in her bag, and a secret that could get her killed. The Union Pacific had deposited her at the Caldwell station on a Wednesday evening in early April, the kind of evening that smelled like rain that had not yet committed to falling and dust, that had been committed to everything for centuries. Sallie was 24 years old, possessed of a schoolteacher's education from a Methodist institution in Ohio, and absolutely without any legitimate business in Caldwell, Kansas. The letter in her bag bore the name of a man called Denton Marsh, who ran a freighting operation east of town, and who, according to the letter, had hired her as a bookkeeper through a correspondent agency in St. Louis. The letter was convincing. Sallie had written it herself. The truth was considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous. Sallie's older brother, Thomas Talbot, had been a Pinkerton operative working an investigation into cattle theft and land fraud that ran from the Kansas Territory all the way back to a ring of investors in Chicago. 3 months ago, Thomas had sent her a letter that was the most careful and frightened piece of writing she had ever received from a man who had never in his life admitted to being afraid of anything. He had told her he had found the hidden ledger. He had told her the names in it would bring down men of significant power and even more significant ruthlessness. He had told her he was leaving the ledger with a woman he trusted in Caldwell, a widow named Clara Foss who ran the boarding house on Elm Street, because he did not trust the mail and he did not trust the Pinkerton office in Kansas City, which he believed had been compromised. 6 weeks after that letter, Thomas Talbot was dead. The official report said his horse had thrown him on the Kisham Trail and he had broken his neck in the fall. Sallie, who had watched her brother ride horses since he was 9 years old, did not believe that for a single second. She had come to Caldwell to get the ledger. She had come with a forged letter and a false name that she had not yet needed, and a sick cold fury that she was managing to carry inside her chest. Only by treating it like a physical object she was responsible for transporting safely. She had not come expecting the Marshal. Samuel McCrae was 31 years old and had been the law in Caldwell for 3 years, which was approximately 2.5 years longer than most men lasted in that position, in a cattle town that sat at the end of the Kisham Trail and received several thousand cowboys and their associated chaos every driving season. He had a reputation that had preceded his arrival in Caldwell from Dodge City, where he had served under Sheriff Pat Masterson, and had made for himself a name that was built entirely on the fact that he was one of the most perceptive men in the territory, and had never, in any confrontation that was well documented, been the one who threw the first punch or fired the first shot, and had never once been the one on the losing end when the confrontation concluded. He also had, according to Denny Alcott, who found him fascinating, a capacity for stillness that unnerved people in a way that shouting never could. Sallie had encountered Samuel McCrae approximately 45 minutes after stepping off the train, when she walked into the Western Star Hotel to inquire about a room, and found him sitting at a corner table in the attached dining room eating what appeared to be beef stew and reading a folded newspaper with the focused attention of a man who was simultaneously tracking every single other thing happening in the room. She had not noticed him immediately. She had noticed him when she gave her false name to the hotel clerk and felt, rather than saw, a particular quality of attention shift in the corner of the room. When she turned, he was looking at the newspaper. But she was a woman who had grown up with a Pinkerton for a brother, and she knew what it looked like when someone was pretending to look at something else. She took her room. She ate alone in the dining room. She drank her coffee and did not look at the corner table and told herself she was imagining things, because she had been frightened for 3 months and frightened people imagine things. Then she went upstairs, and she was not imagining the sound of Marshal McCrae's voice, later that evening, asking the hotel clerk a quiet and friendly question about the new arrivals that day. She sat on her narrow bed in room 7 and thought about Thomas and thought about the ledger and thought about the man downstairs and tried to make a plan that would work. She had 48 hours, she estimated, before whoever had killed her brother might know she was here, if the Pinkerton office in Kansas City was indeed compromised, and if anyone there had intercepted enough of Thomas's communications to know about Clara Foss. She needed to get to Clara Foss before anyone else did. She almost made it. The next morning she walked to Elm Street in the early light, when the town was still shaking itself awake, and the cattle smell from the holding pens at the edge of town was riding the morning breeze with complete lack of apology. Clara Foss's boarding house was a well-kept 2-story frame building with blue paint on the shutters that had not been refreshed recently but still showed the intention of care. Sallie knocked. She heard movement inside, a long pause that felt different from an ordinary pause. She knocked again. The door opened and Clara Foss, who was perhaps 50 with gray-streaked hair and careful eyes, looked at Sallie with an expression that mingled relief with terror in proportions that Sallie found immediately alarming. "You are Thomas's sister," Clara said quietly. It was not a question. "Yes," Sallie said. "Come inside," Clara said. "Come inside and be quick about it." The parlor of the boarding house smelled of coffee and beeswax, and the specific anxiety of a woman who had been keeping a dangerous secret for too long. Clara Foss had the ledger. She confirmed that immediately, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. She had kept it because Thomas had asked her to, because Thomas had been kind to her when nobody else in Caldwell had been particularly kind, and because she was not the sort of woman who let kindness go unreturned even when the price was high. But she was frightened, Clara told Sallie, because 3 days ago a man had come to Caldwell asking questions about Thomas Talbot, questions framed with the surface politeness that Clara recognized as the same texture as a knife kept hidden inside a glove. He had asked about Thomas's friends in town. He had asked whether Thomas had left anything in the keeping of anyone. "What did you tell him?" Sallie asked. "Nothing," Clara said. "I have told nothing to anyone, but he watched this house for 2 days before he left, and I do not think he has gone far." Sallie asked to see the ledger. Clara went upstairs and came back with a cloth-wrapped package the size of a small Bible, and when Sallie unwrapped it, she found herself looking at the kind of document that people died over, which was appropriate because at least one person already had. It was a leather-bound journal dense with columns of figures and names, written in a tight, precise hand that was not Thomas's. It recorded cattle shipments and land transfers and payments, and the names of the men receiving them, and 3 pages in she found a name she recognized from Thomas's cautious letter, a man named Garrison Cole, who was, according to the last newspaper she had read in Ohio, a well-regarded freight and land developer with political connections that reached into the Kansas legislature. According to the ledger, Garrison Cole had been facilitating systematic theft of cattle from homesteaders and small ranchers across the territory for 5 years, bribing county officials and at least 2 territorial judges, and had employed men whose function was described in the ledger with a chilling absence of euphemism. She was still reading when she heard, very clearly, the sound of boots on the boarding house porch. Clara went white. The boots did not knock. They tested the door, found it locked, and moved around the side of the building with the purposeful patience of someone who had done this kind of thing before. Sallie wrapped the ledger and put it inside her dress against her skin, which was where she had already decided it was going the moment she saw it. She told Clara to sit in the parlor and look natural, which was an impossible instruction, but the only available one. Then she went out the back door and directly into the broad chest of a man who was approximately the size of a barn door, and who was extremely startled to find a woman stepping onto him from the back stairs. He recovered his surprise significantly faster than she would have hoped. His hand closed around her wrist, and she hit him with the heel of her other hand exactly the way Thomas had taught her, which bought her exactly the time it took for him to register what had happened and grab her arm again. And she was measuring the distance to the alley when a voice said, very calmly and very clearly, "Let her go." She turned her head. Marshal Samuel McCrae stood in the gap between the boarding house and the woodpile with his arms at his sides, and that particular quality of absolute stillness that she had identified the night before and that now, in the immediate context of a man holding her wrist, looked considerably less unsettling and considerably more useful than it had in the dining room. The man holding her wrist looked at the marshal's badge and made a rapid calculation. He released her wrist, stepped back, and said, "No trouble, Marshal. I came to the wrong house." "You did," Samuel said pleasantly. "Considering this is not your house and you came in the back way, I would say you came to very much the wrong house. Why don't you come with me, and we will talk about navigating the finer points of Caldwell's residential geography." The man went. He went with the air of someone who was not actually concerned about this particular complication, which told Sallie something she filed carefully. She stood in the morning light behind Clara Foss's boarding house with her wrist beginning to bruise and the ledger pressed against her ribs, and watched the marshal walk the man up the alley toward the jail. And then she turned and went back inside and spent the next 10 minutes having a very serious conversation with herself about what she was going to do. She arrived, after those 10 minutes, at the conclusion that she needed to make a choice. She could continue working alone, as she had planned, with the ledger against her skin and a forged letter in her bag, and the disadvantage of being one person who knew this town not at all, in a situation where the opposing interest had at minimum one large man and probably more, and where the man who had just helped her was the same man who had been asking quiet questions about new arrivals the evening before. Or she could tell the Marshal the truth. She sat with that choice for a long time. She thought about Thomas, who had trusted his Pinkerton supervisors and ended up dead. She thought about Clara, who had trusted no one and ended up frightened in her own parlor. She thought about the ledger against her ribs and the names in it, and what they meant for the homesteaders and the ranchers, and the people who had lost cattle and land to Garrison Cole's systematic theft. She thought about what Thomas would do, and then she thought harder about what Thomas had actually done, which was trust the wrong people. And she tried to make an honest assessment of Samuel McCrae based on 36 hours of observation. What she had observed was a man who had come to a back alley behind a boarding house at 7 in the morning without apparent prior notification, which meant he had been watching the boarding house, which meant he had been watching her, which meant he was considerably more on top of things than she had hoped. He had intervened without escalating. He had handled a large and dangerous man without violence or visible effort. He had not, in the moment of that intervention, asked her any questions, which was either an indication of exceptional professional restraint or an indication that he already knew enough not to need them. She walked to the Marshal's office at 8 o'clock in the morning with every card she held in her hands and made the most frightening bet of her life. Samuel McCrae was sitting behind his desk writing up a report on the man from the boarding house alley who had given a false name that Samuel had already identified as false. He looked up when Sallie came in. His expression was professionally neutral. His eyes were not. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be asked. She took the ledger out from under her dress and put it on his desk. She watched his eyes change. "My name is Sallie Talbot," she said. "My brother was Thomas Talbot, who was a Pinkerton agent investigating Garrison Cole and who was murdered on the Kishom Trail 6 weeks ago. That is the ledger he died to protect, and I need to know whether you are someone I can trust with it or whether I have just made a catastrophic mistake." The silence that followed was the kind that had actual weight to it. Samuel McCrae looked at the ledger. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger again. He did not reach for it. "How long have you been planning to tell me this?" he said. "Approximately 40 minutes, she said. "Before that, I was planning not to." "What changed your mind? You came to that alley alone, no deputy, no crowd. You handled a man who outweighed you by 50 pounds with a calm that suggested you do this regularly, and you did not once act like doing it gave you any pleasure." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a thin basis for trust," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm aware of that, but thin is what I have available." Something moved across his expression that she could not fully read. He leaned forward and looked at the ledger without touching it. "Garrison Cole," he said. "I have been building a case on Cole for 8 months. He has interests in Caldwell, in Wichita, in 3 other cattle towns. He has a man on the county commission and at least one territorial judge who rules favorably in land dispute cases with a consistency that goes beyond coincidence." He looked up at her. "If your brother found what I think he found, then you are in considerably more danger than you appear to be accounting for." "I am accounting for it fully," Sallie said. "I have simply decided to account for it loudly rather than quietly." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that were doing that thing where they were reading something she could not see the text of. Then he said, "All right. Tell me everything from the beginning and do not leave anything out." She told him everything. It took 2 hours, 3 cups of coffee that his deputy Hector Loon made without comment and delivered without entering the room too obviously, and one moment where her voice went flat and she had to stop and reassemble herself when she talked about Thomas. Samuel did not say anything useful during that moment. He also did not say anything useless, which she found she valued more than usefulness. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he said, "The man from the alley gave me a name which was false. His real name is Cullen Briggs. He works for a man named Arlo Deeks, who is Cole's primary enforcement agent in the territory. If Briggs is here, Deeks is not far, And if Deeks is here, it is because they know about the ledger. How much time do we have? Sallie asked. Very little, Samuel said. This was the beginning of the days that changed everything, and they changed everything so completely that Sallie would find it difficult afterward to reconstruct who she had been before them except in the most general terms. Samuel moved her out of the Western Star Hotel and into the back room of his office, which was small and had a narrow cot and a window that looked onto the alley, but which was safe in a way that no other location in Caldwell could be, because of the simple material fact that Samuel McCrae was in it a large percentage of every 24 hours. He deputized Clara Foss informally, in the sense that he asked her to carry on normally and to report anything she observed. And Clara, who had the backbone that fear had been temporarily covering, agreed with the decisiveness of a woman who had been waiting for something useful to do. Samuel sent a telegram to a federal marshal he trusted personally, a man named Gordon Avery in Topeka, using a prearranged code that he explained to Sallie with the matter-of-fact manner of someone who had been operating in layered danger for long enough that private codes felt ordinary. He did not send anything through Kansas City. During those first days, while they waited and watched and built their case and anticipated Garrison Cole's next move, Sallie and Samuel spent an extraordinary amount of time in the small office room, and they talked the way people talk when they have already bypassed the usual stages of acquaintance because the circumstances have required it. They talked about Thomas and about what he had been and what his death meant, and Samuel listened to this without the flinching discomfort that most people brought to grief, which she found was a profound relief. They talked about the territory and what was happening to the small ranchers and the homesteaders as Cole's operation moved through it like a slow, quiet catastrophe, taking land and cattle and livelihoods through legal mechanisms that were only legal because the judges were bought. Samuel talked about this with a particular quality of controlled anger that told her this was not professional for him only, and she asked him about it directly because she had learned already that he responded to directness better than most people. He told her then about his father, who had come to the Kansas territory from Pennsylvania when Samuel was 12, with a wife and 3 children and a genuine belief in the possibility of building something in new land. They had homesteaded 60 miles east of Caldwell, and they had built something, slowly and with enormous work, and then a land claim dispute had gone before a judge who had found against them on grounds that their surveying documents were insufficient, and they had lost the land, and his mother had died the winter after that of a combination of pneumonia and the specific damage that prolonged hardship does to a person's will to fight illness. His father had moved to Wichita and taken work in a stockyard. His brothers had scattered. Samuel had become a lawman, he told her, because the alternative was becoming the kind of man who solved the problem from the other side of legality, and he had decided, at the age of 17, that he wanted to solve it from the right side for reasons that were both principled and deeply personal, because he wanted it solved in a way that would hold, and not just in a way that would make him feel temporarily better about the injustice of it. Sallie listened to all of this and felt the particular sensation of watching a person come into focus, the way a figure comes clear through morning mist, feature by feature, until suddenly you are looking at a whole and complete human being rather than a shape. She told him in return about her own life, which had been nothing like as dramatic but which was hers. She told him about the Methodist school in Ohio and the ambition she had harbored to study law, which was a closed door in 1882 and which she had accepted with more grace than she actually felt. She told him about the correspondent agency work she had done after the school, writing letters for businesses, proofreading contracts, understanding the shape of the professional world through documents even if she could not enter it directly. She told him that working with Thomas's notes on the ledger had been the first time she had ever felt that her particular set of skills had a use equal to their weight. On the third evening, They were sitting across from each other at the small desk that was barely large enough for two sets of elbows, going through the ledger for the fourth time, and building an annotated key that would make it comprehensible to a federal court, when Samuel said, without looking up from the page, "You are the most competent person I have worked with in 3 years, including every deputy and federal agent and Pinkerton operative I have coordinated with." She was so surprised that she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You should tell that to the institutions that decline to educate women in law." He looked up. "I should," he said, and the complete lack of caveat or condescension in his voice was so unexpected that she felt something shift somewhere in the internal geography she had thought was entirely occupied by grief and urgency and fear. She redirected her attention to the ledger. The trap that Garrison Cole and Arlo Deeks were setting for them revealed itself on the 5th day, which was a Thursday, when a man came to Samuel's office with a story about having witnessed Cullen Briggs leaving the county record's office with documents he had not entered with, which was either a genuine tip or a piece of misdirection designed to draw Samuel away from Sallie and the ledger, and which Samuel identified as the latter within approximately 3 minutes of the man finishing his story. He thanked the man politely, let him leave, and then turned to Sallie. "They are going to come for the ledger tonight," he said, "directly. They have exhausted their attempts to find where it is through intermediaries, and they are going to come directly." "How many?" she asked. "Deeks usually works with 3 men," Samuel said. "Briggs is one. There are 2 others who are currently in Caldwell, both arrived 2 days ago, both with the kind of background that makes the hair stand up on the back of my experienced neck." Sallie looked at the ledger on the desk. She thought about Thomas. She thought about her careful, frightened letter and what it had meant that he wrote it. She thought about 5 years of homesteaders losing their land and ranchers losing their cattle, and all of it documented in that leather book. "What do we do?" She said. "We use the ledger as bait," Samuel said, "but we change what it is bait for. They want the ledger so it cannot reach a federal court. I want Deeks and the men Cole has in the county commission and the territorial court, so they cannot do this to anyone else." He laid out the plan with the systematic clarity of a man who had been thinking 3 moves ahead since before she arrived in Caldwell. He would move the ledger to a specific location, known to Deeks through the planted information of the man who had come with the tip, which was real information just strategically incomplete. He would be there when Deeks came for it. Deputy Hector Loon, who was a compact and fiercely loyal man from Texas who had been with Samuel for 2 years, would cover the approach. Sallie would be in a specific location with the annotated key they had made from the ledger, which was now actually more complete and more legally actionable than the original, and which she would be delivering personally to Federal Marshal Gordon Avery, who had responded to Samuel's coded telegram and was arriving in Caldwell Thursday evening on the eastbound train. "I want you on that train platform when Avery arrives," Samuel said. "I want you to hand him the annotated key personally and tell him everything you know, not filtered through my account of it but directly. Your brother was a Pinkerton operative. You are his next of kin and the person who identified the ledger's content. Your testimony matters as much as the document." Something about the way he said this, the way he treated her knowledge and her account as evidentiary rather than ancillary, the way he had been treating her throughout these days as a partner in this rather than as a person he was protecting around, made her look at him for a moment in a way she had been carefully not looking at him. "You trust me with this," she said. "I have trusted you with this since you walked into my office and put the ledger on my desk," he said. "You decided to trust me. I had already decided." She looked away first. "When did you decide?" "When you sat down in the chair across from my desk without waiting to be invited," he said. "I decided that a woman who walks into a marshal's office in a town she does not know with a piece of evidence that dangerous and sits down like she belongs there is either the most reckless person I have ever encountered or the most courageous one, and reckless people do not write annotated keys." The train platform was lit by two hanging lanterns that moved in the evening wind and made the shadows swing. Sallie stood with the annotated key inside her shawl and watched the eastbound come in along its rails with the fire and smoke of it doing dramatic things in the dark, and thought about how the last time she had stood on a train platform she had been arriving with a forged letter and a cold fury that had not yet found its shape. Gordon Avery was a tall man with a silver badge and a face that had made peace with a lot of difficult information over a long career. He shook her hand when she introduced herself, which was not common in 1882 and which she noted. She gave him the annotated key and she told him everything, and he listened the way Samuel listened, with complete attention and without performing surprise at things that were genuinely surprising. At the same time, on the west end of Caldwell, Arlo Deeks and his 3 men went to the location where they had been led to believe the ledger was held, and they found, instead of an unguarded building, Samuel McCrae and Hector Loon, and a confrontation that was managed with the precise calibration that had built Samuel's reputation over 3 years in Caldwell. Deeks and his men were disarmed without fatal violence, which Samuel had been particular about, because he needed them in a condition to testify, and the papers they were carrying when arrested included, because people under pressure make predictable mistakes, written instructions from Garrison Cole that constituted direct evidence of conspiracy. Cole himself was in Wichita. He was arrested the following morning by federal marshals working in coordination with Avery's office, and the hotel where he had been staying was searched, and the documents found there added several chapters to the story the ledger had already told. None of this happened cleanly or without complication. The county commissioner Cole had in his pocket made 2 attempts to obstruct the process that required Samuel's sustained attention over the following weeks. The compromised territorial judge resigned before he could be officially brought up on charges, which was both a legal frustration and a practical relief. The 2 ranch hands who had been working directly under Deeks turned federal witness in exchange for reduced sentences and provided testimony that tied the operation together in ways that the documentary evidence alone could not fully accomplish. Through all of it, Sallie stayed in Caldwell. She stayed initially because Avery asked her to remain available as a witness. She stayed after that because the process required her continued testimony and her continued work on the documents, because she had the skills for it, and because Samuel asked her with a directness that had become the register of their relationship, not requesting in the way people request favors, but stating in the way people state necessary facts, that having her available made a material difference to the case. She stayed after that for reasons that had less to do with the case. They were not reasons she examined immediately. They lived in the territory of things she was aware of without being prepared to name, the way you are aware of a change in the weather through the quality of the light before you have registered it consciously. She was aware of it when Samuel came back to the office after a day of managing the legal and political complications of Cole's arrest, and sat down across from her, and the tension went out of his shoulders in a way that was small and probably involuntary, and that she observed without comment. She was aware of it when she found that the hours working beside him felt different from the hours not working beside him, in a way that was not purely about the efficiency of collaboration. She was aware of it one evening when the day's work was done, and they were sitting on the steps of the office in the cool spring dark, and Samuel was talking about what the territory might look like in 10 years if the federal government got serious about land law enforcement. And she was listening and contributing and thinking simultaneously, in a part of her mind that she had not authorized for this purpose, that she could do this exact thing indefinitely. Sit on these steps in this dark and have this conversation, that the specific person doing it with her was not incidental to the appeal. She named it to herself that night, alone in the back room with the narrow cot and the alley window, and did so with the honesty she applied to everything, which was to say she did not dress it in euphemism or comfortable vagueness. She was falling in love with Samuel McCrae, which was inconvenient and complicated and possibly mutual. And the possibly was the part that required the most honest examination, because she could not afford to be wrong about something that mattered this much. She examined the evidence. She examined it with the same systematic attention she had brought to the ledger and to the annotated key. She had spent 3 weeks in close proximity to a man who was, by any reasonable standard, exceptional, and who treated her as exceptional in return, and who had on several occasions looked at her with an expression that was not professionally neutral, and that he seemed to become aware of and redirect. This was data. She catalogued it carefully and without sentimentality. Samuel, on his side of this situation, was having a version of the same experience and handling it with the same or slightly less elegance. He had not, in 3 years of marshalling in Caldwell, spent significant time wanting anything from his personal life beyond the reliable functioning of his professional one. He had a clear idea of justice and worked toward it with total commitment, and found in that work enough of what he needed that the gap where other things might have lived did not trouble him much. He had come from loss and had built something useful from it, and he did not look back. Sallie Talbot had walked into his office and put a dangerous book on his desk, and looked at him with the eyes of someone who had done the risk calculation and decided to proceed anyway. And something in him had recognized something in her in a way that was immediate and complicated, and that he was not entirely sure what to do with. He was not a man who operated well in ambiguity except in the specific professional context where ambiguity was a tool. In his personal life, ambiguity had a tendency to become the thing you tripped over in the dark when you were trying to get somewhere important. He decided, after some time, that he needed to say something. He decided this the day Avery told them both that the legal case was substantively complete and that Sally's continued presence in Caldwell, while welcome, was no longer strictly required by the case. Samuel waited until that evening. He found Sallie on the steps of the office again, where she had taken to sitting in the evenings when the weather permitted, and he sat beside her with the specific deliberateness of someone who has decided what they are going to say and is in the process of beginning to say it. "Avery told you," she said before he could begin. "Yes," he said. "He told me too," she said. "He said I was free to go back to Ohio whenever I chose." A pause. The street was quiet in the way of late evening, a horse tied outside the saloon 2 buildings down, a lamp moving behind a curtain in the house across the way. "What are you going to do?" Samuel asked. She turned and looked at him. "I am waiting to see what you say next," she said. He looked back at her. In the lamplight from the office window his expression was the most unguarded she had seen it, and what it showed was something that answered the question she had been carefully not asking. "I would like you to stay," he said. "I am aware that is insufficient as a statement of reason, and I am working up to the sufficient version, but I want to start by being clear about the conclusion." She felt something that was warm and terrifying and entirely too large for the volume of the evening air available to contain it. "The conclusion is helpful," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "What is the sufficient version of the reason?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had learned by now that his quiet was not evasion but assembly, that he was the kind of man who built what he was going to say before he said it rather than thinking out loud. "The sufficient version," he said finally, "is that I have spent 3 weeks working alongside someone who is honest and precise and principled and extraordinarily capable, and who looks at the world with the same attention to what is actually true rather than what is comfortable that I have spent my entire professional life trying to operate by. And I would like the opportunity to know her better under circumstances that are not being managed around the edges by Arlo Deeks." She looked at the street for a moment, then she said, "That is sufficient." When he reached over in the cool spring evening and took her hand with the careful certainty of someone who is not a man given to gestures, but who means this one completely, she thought about Thomas, Not with grief exactly, but with the particular tenderness of wishing someone could know the thing you most want them to know. And she thought he would have found Samuel McCrae exactly right in every respect that mattered. She stayed. She stayed through May and into June, living now at Clara Foss's boarding house in the room with the blue-painted shutters, which Clara had pressed upon her with a warmth that was partly generous and partly, Sallie suspected, the satisfaction of a woman who felt that the appropriate outcome had arrived and was now pleased to facilitate it. Clara had been through too much to waste time on indirection, and she told Sallie within the first week of the new arrangement that Samuel McCrae was the finest man in Caldwell and the most stubborn, and that any woman willing to match him honestly would do well. And then she served her a piece of dried apple pie and moved on to other subjects with the efficiency of someone who had made their point. Samuel came to dinner at the boarding house on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He and Sallie walked in the evenings when the day's work allowed it. He told her about the territory, and she told him about Ohio, and they told each other about the things that lived in the interior spaces that people do not usually open for visitors, the formative losses and the foundational beliefs and the private ways they understood themselves. Each conversation was another degree of known, and being known by him was the most specific and extraordinary feeling she had encountered in 24 years of living. The case against Garrison Cole went to a federal court in June. Sallie traveled to Topeka to testify, and Samuel traveled with her in his capacity as a primary witness and in his other capacity, which was the one that meant he sat beside her on the train and periodically looked at her in a way that made Denny Alcott, who happened to be on the same train visiting his sister in Topeka, describe the scene to his sister in detail that his sister found compelling. The court found against Cole on charges of land fraud, cattle theft through falsified documentation, and conspiracy. Cole was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The 2 county commissioners who had been in his employ resigned and were separately prosecuted. The territorial judge continued to have avoided prosecution by resigning first, which remained a frustration, but Avery promised that the federal statute was being examined for ways to address that gap. Thomas Talbot's name was entered into the official record as having conducted the investigation that made the prosecution possible. This was important to Sallie in a way that was not about credit or recognition, but about the simple truth of it, that his work had meaning, and that the meaning was acknowledged. She sat in the federal courtroom in Topeka and heard his name spoken by a federal judge and felt something settle in the grief she had been carrying, not dissolve but settle, the way a heavy thing stops moving and comes to rest. She cried in the hotel corridor afterward, where she had gone expecting to be alone, and was not alone because Samuel had followed her out and stood beside her with the uncomplicated presence of someone who is not trying to fix grief, but simply to be present for it. And after a while, she leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. It was on the train back to Caldwell 2 days later that Samuel said, in the direct way he said things that were important, "I would like to ask you something, but I want to be certain you are not in a place where the question will feel like pressure." She looked at him. "Ask me," she said. "I would like to know whether you intend to go back to Ohio," he said, "because I would like to ask you to marry me, and I cannot decide whether it is possible to do that honestly without knowing the answer to the first question." Outside the train window, the Kansas prairie was doing its enormous, golden, indifferent thing in the late afternoon light. She looked at it for a moment and then she looked at him. "I have no intention of going back to Ohio," she said. "I have not had that intention for approximately 5 weeks. I have been trying to decide whether it was reasonable to stay in a town where I arrived under a false name with a forged letter on the basis of a man I have known for 6 weeks. And," he said. "And I have decided," she said, "that reasonable and right are not always the same category, and that I have been operating in the right category ever since I sat down in your office without waiting to be invited, and that it has served me considerably better than being careful would have." He was quiet for a moment in that assembling way of his. Then he said, "Is that a yes?" "That is very much a yes," she said. He took her hand on the train the way he had on the office steps, with the same careful certainty, and she thought that this was probably what it looked like when something that was supposed to happen arrived at the moment it was supposed to arrive. Not smooth and orchestrated, but real and a little rough at the edges, and entirely true. They were married in Caldwell in July of 1882, in the Methodist Church at the end of Elm Street, in a ceremony conducted by a minister who had been in the territory long enough to not be surprised by anything, and who found the whole affair deeply satisfactory. Clara Foss stood with Sallie. Hector Loon stood with Samuel. Denny Alcott attended and wrote a letter to his sister in Topeka that was 4 pages long. The town of Caldwell had opinions about the marriage. The town of Caldwell had opinions about everything. There were people who found it irregular that a woman who had arrived as a stranger under circumstances that had not been fully clarified in the public understanding should end up as the Marshal's wife, and they expressed these opinions in the registers that opinions are expressed in small towns, the sidewalk conversations and the over-the-fence comments and the loaded silences. Samuel was aware of these opinions. He did not address them directly, because they were not worth addressing directly, but he addressed them by conducting his life with Sallie in the explicit and unapologetic manner of a man who has made a decision and considered it made. He introduced her to every official, every rancher, every cattle buyer he dealt with professionally, as his wife, without the apologetic hedging that might have invited the inference that he considered any aspect of it to require apology. And then there was the morning in late July, perhaps 3 weeks after the wedding, when a matter in the county required Samuel to ride out east of town and return by the main road, and Sallie had business at the land office that morning related to the documentation for a small claim that Clara Foss had been attempting to establish for the piece of property adjacent to her boarding house, and they rode back into Caldwell together. Arriving at the top of Main Street at approximately 9 in the morning on a Tuesday with the sun well up and every storefront occupied and every porch populated, Samuel had known this moment would come in some form. Small towns have a way of requiring people to establish publicly what they have established privately, and he was the kind of man who understood that the public version of a thing was not separate from the private version, but was rather the same thing under different conditions, and that what he did in this moment would say something that needed to be said. He rode down the center of Main Street with Sallie beside him, not trailing, not at a polite remove. Beside him, the way you ride beside someone who is your equal and your partner, and who you are choosing, in front of everyone and everything, to acknowledge completely. He did not look at the faces on the porches and the faces at the windows with anything that could be described as challenge precisely, but with a settled directness that was somehow more definitive than challenge. He looked at them the way a man looks when he has considered all the available arguments and found that none of them apply. Jonah's Priestley opened his mouth outside the feed store, and his wife put her hand on his arm. He closed his mouth. Sallie rode beside Samuel and felt the weight of every eye and did not bend under it, and did not perform unbending, because performing would have required acknowledging what she was performing against, and she had decided that it did not warrant that much of her attention. She had the ledger, and she had testified in a federal court, and she had won what she came to win, and she was married to the finest man she knew, and they were riding down the main street of the town, where she intended to spend the rest of her life, and the opinions of the people on the porches were their own business and their own limitation. They rode all the way down Main Street and turned at the far end and came back up, and when they passed the office, Samuel tipped his hat to Hector Loon, who was standing outside it, and Hector Loon tipped his hat back with the ghost of a smile that suggested he was aware of exactly what he had just witnessed. The summer settled into the new shape of their life. The Marshal's house was a small frame structure behind the office that Samuel had been occupying for 3 years, with the minimal furniture of someone who had not had any particular use for a home before. Sallie approached the project of making it a home with the organized attention she brought to everything, and the results were neither fancy nor spare, but exactly suited to the people living in it. She found work that used her skills, first through the assistance she continued to provide to the federal case's administrative process, then through an arrangement with Caldwell's only attorney, a dry and honest man named Preston Webb, who engaged her to draft correspondence and review documents at a professional rate that he stated without either self-congratulation or apology, because he was practical enough to know value when it presented itself. The work was not what she might have done in a world that opened different doors to her, but it was real and it was hers, and it was performed in a town where she knew the history of the land beneath her feet and the names in the account books, and the way the light hit the prairie at the end of the day in a manner that still, months later, struck her as one of the most extraordinary things she had ever seen. In September of 1882, a small incident occurred that closed the last open question the summer had left. Cullen Briggs, the man from Clara Foss's back alley who had been in federal custody pending trial as a witness against Cole, escaped from the Wichita jail. He was loose for 4 days before Samuel tracked him to a farmstead 20 miles south of Caldwell, where he had been hiding in a barn. Samuel brought him back alone, with Briggs riding in front and his wrists tied and his attitude considerably reduced from its initial dimensions. He returned on a Wednesday afternoon and rode straight to the federal marshal's office to hand Briggs over to the federal jurisdiction, and then he came home. Sallie was at the kitchen table annotating a land claim document for Preston Webb when Samuel walked through the door, and she looked up and read the tiredness in him and put down her pen. He sat at the table across from her and said, with the specific directness that had always been his register, "I would like to talk about whether Caldwell is still the right place." She looked at him carefully. "What are you asking?" "I am asking," he said, "whether you would like to stay in Caldwell or whether you would like to consider other options. There are marshalling positions in other towns. There are places where your work with Preston Webb could expand into something larger. I am asking what you want, separate from what you have adapted to wanting." She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about Ohio, which was her past, and about Caldwell, which was her present, and about what she actually wanted when she was honest about it. She thought about Clara and about Hector, and about Preston Webb's dry practicality, and about the way the prairie looked at the end of the day, and about the boardwalk outside the marshal's office where she had sat on 3 different evenings in different emotional conditions, and found in each case something that helped. "I want to stay in Caldwell," she said. "Not because I have adapted to wanting it, because I actually want it." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was his closest equivalent to relief, which was not a dramatic expression but was entirely real. "Good," he said. "I am glad." She smiled at him across the table. "Were you worried I would say otherwise?" "I was not worried," he said. "I was accounting for the possibility. There is a difference." The autumn moved through the territory in its enormous, unhurried way, turning the grasses to amber and the cottonwood to yellow, and the sky to that particular shade of deep blue that the Kansas autumn does with the confidence of something that has nothing to prove. Sallie wrote to her parents in Ohio, who knew Thomas was gone and who had been frightened for Sallie, and who received the news of her marriage and her situation in Caldwell with a complex mixture of relief and apprehension that she received back from them in careful letters and managed with patient correspondence. Her mother came to visit in November, a woman named Talbot who was small and precise in ways that explained several things about Sallie, and who stepped off the westbound train and looked at Caldwell with the expression of a person making a rapid and fair-minded assessment of something unfamiliar. She met Samuel and shook his hand and looked at him with the same honest evaluating attention that Sallie had applied to everything since birth and that Sallie clearly inherited. And after dinner on the first evening she found a moment alone with Sallie in the kitchen and said, "He is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Sallie asked. "I am not certain," Eleanor said. "Something rougher, I suppose. Something that would explain why you stayed. But he is not rough at all. He is very careful." "Yes," Sallie said, "he is." "He looks at you the way your father looks at me," Eleanor said, in a matter-of-fact tone that was the closest she generally came to sentiment. And then she dried a plate and said nothing more about it because she had made her point. Eleanor stayed for 2 weeks and went home on the eastbound on a Monday morning, having revised her opinion of Kansas from alarming to potentially viable, which was as far as she was prepared to go in a first visit. She kissed Sallie at the station and shook Samuel's hand again and said, "Take care of her," in the tone she used when she was saying something she meant completely but was trying not to overweight. Samuel said, "She takes considerable care of herself, but I will do my part," and Eleanor Talbot smiled at him and got on the train. Winter in the Kansas Territory was a different country from winter anywhere else Sallie had been, and she was not entirely prepared for the scale of it. The way the cold came in with a commitment that made Ohio winters seem like suggestions. The prairie under snow was an utterly alien landscape, vast and white and indifferent, and the wind off it had an authority that she found she respected in the way you respect anything that is genuinely more powerful than you are and not interested in your opinion about it. She and Samuel spent the winter months the way the territory demanded, with a focus on the immediate and the practical and the close to hand, and she found that the enforced intimacy of winter in a small house was a different kind of knowing than all the conversations on the steps and the evenings at the boarding house. This was the undefended version of a person, the person they were when the weather required everyone to drop the performances that warmer months permitted. She loved him differently in winter. She found, more specifically, more particularly, with a precision that came from knowing the shape of him under the conditions that stripped away everything, but what was actually there. He was, she discovered, exceptionally good at being quiet with. He was funny in a way that was dry and contextual, and that got funnier the better you knew him. He was a man who could fix things with his hands, not in a show-off way, but in the practical way of someone who had learned that things break and someone has to fix them, and he was willing to be that person. He woke early and made coffee before she was up and left it where she would find it. And this was a small thing, but it was the kind of small thing that accumulates into something that cannot be adequately named, but is absolutely real. She was, he found, a more constant and comprehensive presence than he had understood. She organized information with a near-frightening efficiency, and had an ability to anticipate what was needed before he had articulated what was needed, which was professionally extraordinary and personally extraordinary in entirely different ways. She also had opinions about everything, which she expressed without apology and which were, more often than not, correct. And the occasions when they were not correct she acknowledged with the directness she applied to being right, which he found remarkable and admirable and occasionally maddening, and never dull. She had a laugh that she deployed rarely enough that it felt like a gift when it arrived. She trusted with extreme care but with total commitment once the care had been satisfied. She was grieving, always in some quiet back room of herself, for Thomas, and she did not try to pretend otherwise, and he loved her for not pretending, because pretending would have been a wall between them and there were no walls between them, and he wanted to keep it that way. The spring of 1883 came in with the characteristic territorial extravagance, the grasses coming back, the cattle drives beginning to build toward summer, the town filling back up with the energy and chaos of the season. Hector Loon's wife, a woman named Maria who had come up from Texas with strong views and excellent cooking, became a consistent part of Sallie and Samuel's social landscape, and the four of them fell into the pattern of Sunday dinners that rotated between the two houses, and that became the social foundation of both households. Preston Webb, the attorney, offered Sallie an expanded role in the spring of 1883, taking on the formal management of his document work and correspondence at a rate that was more proportionate to the work's value than the initial arrangement, and she accepted without the false modesty that she had always found counterproductive. She was good at what she did, and she knew it, and she appreciated that Preston Webb knew it and said so directly. It was in April of 1883 that she told Samuel she was expecting their first child. In the direct way, she told him things that were important, sitting at the kitchen table with the morning coffee between them. She watched his face do something she had only seen it do a handful of times, which was to become completely unguarded in a way that required no reading, because what it showed was entirely on the surface. He was happy, in the uncomplicated full-depth way that people are happy when something they have wanted without fully admitting wanting it arrives. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing he said and which she found entirely characteristic and entirely right. "I am very well," she said. "I am also somewhat terrified, which I believe is appropriate." "It is very appropriate," he said. "I am also somewhat terrified." "Good," she said. "We will be terrified together, which is my preferred condition for managing things." The summer of 1883 brought the cattle drives and the heat, and the complications that the season reliably delivered, and Samuel managed them with the same steady competence that had defined his tenure in Caldwell, and Sallie worked with Preston Webb and grew increasingly large, and continued to have opinions about everything, and to be right about most of them. And Clara Foss attached herself to the project of the approaching child, with a proprietary warmth that neither Samuel nor Sallie found unwelcome. Gordon Avery came through Caldwell in June on his way west and stopped to visit, and over dinner told them that Garrison Cole had attempted to negotiate a reduced sentence in exchange for more names, and had produced 3 names of territorial officials that the federal office had not previously identified, and the prosecutions were ongoing. He also told them that the Pinkerton Agency had completed an internal review prompted in part by Thomas Talbot's case, and that 2 operatives in the Kansas City office had been identified as having taken payments from Cole's network. They had been dismissed and were facing separate prosecutions. Sallie listened to this and felt the familiar complex thing that Thomas's memory produced, the grief and the satisfaction, and the wish that the satisfaction could be delivered to him directly. After Avery left and she and Samuel were sitting on the porch in the summer evening, she told him what she was feeling, because by this point she told him most things she was feeling, on the basis that he was the person she had found that she could do that with. He listened, and when she was done he said, he would know. "I believe that. The work matters and the meaning of it carries forward, and the person who did it is part of that, regardless of whether they are here to see it." She looked at him. "Do you believe that?" "I have made myself believe it," he said, "because the alternative is to believe that the things my mother built and lost, and the things your brother built and lost are simply gone, and I cannot operate on that basis. So yes, I believe it." She leaned against him on the porch in the summer dark, and he put his arm around her, and they sat for a while with the prairie doing its enormous nighttime thing around them, the insects and the stars and the dark, warm wind, and she thought that this was the life she had arrived at by a route she could not have predicted, and that it was more complete than she had known how to want. Their son was born in October of 1883. A healthy and opinionated boy who arrived in the world with the minimum of patience for the process and the maximum of volume in expressing his opinions about it, which Clara Foss declared was entirely appropriate, and Hector Loon found deeply amusing. They named him Thomas Samuel McCrae, and the naming was a decision they had made together, and that required no extended discussion, because it was simply the right name, and they both knew it immediately. Samuel held his son in the first hours after his birth with the careful certainty that was his hallmark in all the important things, and he looked at him the way he had looked at the ledger on the desk, with complete attention and the clear intention to understand what he was holding and to do right by it. Sallie watched this from where she was resting, with a tiredness that was enormous and a satisfaction that was larger than the tiredness, and felt something that she had no fully adequate word for, which was the feeling of a life that had been built rather than happened to, of a thing that was genuinely, specifically hers. Little Thomas was, by the following spring, a person with strongly held views about breakfast and excellent rolling technique, and a laugh that had arrived, in the genetic lottery, as a direct reproduction of Sally's rarely deployed version, which meant that when it came out, which was with increasing frequency as he discovered the reliability with which it appeared, it was a gift to everyone in the room. Samuel watched his son with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and with an additional quality that Sallie identified as wonder, which was not an emotion she had previously associated with him and which was, she discovered, among the most affecting things she had ever seen in him. He was a good father in the same way he was a good marshal, not performatively but fundamentally, with the real work done in the quiet, sustained, ordinary days, rather than in moments that could be narrated dramatically. The spring of 1884 brought changes to Caldwell in the way that springs in the territory tended to, the cycle of the cattle drives resuming, the town's population temporarily swelling, the demands on Samuel's time intensifying. But it also brought a letter from Gordon Avery that had been expected and was still, when it arrived, significant. The letter informed Samuel that a federal marshaling position was being created for the northern Kansas territory, a senior appointment that would give him jurisdiction, beyond Caldwell and access to federal resources, in a way that the town marshalship did not, and that Avery was recommending him for it with the full support of the federal office in Topeka. The position would require them to relocate to a larger town. Abilene was the current thinking, where the federal presence was being expanded. Samuel brought the letter home and gave it to Sallie and sat across the table from her while she read it, which was their established method for this kind of decision, and when she finished she put it down and thought for a while. "Abilene is larger," she said. "Considerably," he said. "Preston Webb will be difficult to replace," she said. "He may know someone," Samuel said. She looked at the letter again. "The position is what you have been working toward," she said. "Not this specific form, but the principle of it, federal jurisdiction. The ability to act on the kind of case you built against Cole but without being limited to Caldwell's geography." "Yes," he said. "Then we should go," she said. "The principle of it is right and the work is right, and the reason to stay in Caldwell is not Caldwell itself but the life we have here, and we can take the life with us." He looked at her for a moment. "You are certain?" "I am certain about what matters," she said. Thomas would have been inclined to stay because he liked the familiar, and it got him in the end. "I am more inclined to go where the work is real, because that is what I came west for in the first place." He smiled then, which was the version of his expression that she had been collecting since they met, and that she could now read completely, and he reached across the table and took her hand in the way she had learned to read as his language for the things he said without words. They left Caldwell in June of 1884, on a morning that was warm and slightly windy, with the smell of the cattle pens still in the air, and the cottonwoods along the creek road in full leaf. Clara Foss stood outside her boarding house with her blue-painted shutters and cried without making any particular attempt to conceal it, and Hector Loon and Maria stood outside the marshal's office, and Denny Alcott stood at the telegraph office door because he happened to be there, and also because he wanted to. And the town turned out in the way that small towns turn out when someone who has mattered to them is leaving. Not in a crowd exactly, but in the distributed way of people who are busy, but find they need to be in the street at a certain time for reasons they do not entirely want to examine. Sallie held Thomas on her hip and said goodbye to Clara with a completeness that tried to account for everything Clara had been. The woman who had trusted her brother and kept his secret and opened her back door and become, in the months after, as close to family as anyone outside blood could be. She said goodbye to Hector, who was steady and loyal and who would be a good marshal in his own right when he had the opportunity, and to Maria, who had been company in the way that only another woman can be, with the kind of understanding that does not need all its translations spoken aloud. She got in the wagon and looked back at the main street of Caldwell one time, at the dusty boards and the familiar signs and the Methodist church at the end of Elm Street, and the office steps where things had been decided, and felt the specific tenderness that comes from leaving a place that has made you rather than found you. Then she looked forward. Samuel drove the wagon out of Caldwell on the northbound road and did not look back either, not because he was indifferent to what he was leaving, but because he was the kind of man who looked at what was in front of him and trusted that what was behind him was not lost, only rearranged. Abilene in 1884 was a town that had already had its most dramatic years behind it, and had settled into the serious business of being a place where people actually lived rather than just passed through, which suited Samuel's professional purposes and suited Sallie's temperament. The federal marshaling office was housed in a solid brick building on the main street, which was an improvement in construction over Caldwell's frame office, and it came with a deputy who had been waiting for a senior marshal with some impatience, and who turned out to be a capable young woman from Georgia named Adelaide Branch, who had the history of having once sat on a man twice her size until the county sheriff arrived, which was the kind of resumed detail that Sallie found immediately compelling. Samuel took up his new position with the same total commitment he brought to everything, and within 6 months had opened 3 new investigations into land and cattle fraud in the Northern Territory, and had established a reputation in Abilene that was built on the same foundations as his reputation in Caldwell, which was the reputation of a man who was always exactly as serious as he said he was. Sallie found a new arrangement with Abilene's most significant attorney, a woman named Harriet Cross, who had read law by apprenticeship in a way that the bar could not prevent, and who ran the most organized legal practice Sallie had ever encountered, and who engaged Sallie's services with the frank professionalism of someone who recognized a peer. The work expanded in ways that the Caldwell work had not, touching on more cases, more complex documentation, more of the legal architecture of a growing territory, and Sallie found in it a satisfaction proportionate to the complexity. Thomas, now a toddler with an enormous personality and his father's dark eyes, and his mother's precise attention to everything he decided mattered, made friends with the butcher's son down the street with the efficiency of children who have not yet learned the adult's reasons for hesitating, and could be found on most afternoons in the small yard at the back of the house they rented on Maple Street, engaged in projects that required dirt and optimism in equal measure. The second year in Abilene, Sallie discovered she was expecting their second child, and told Samuel in the same direct way she had told him the first time, at the kitchen table with the coffee between them. He reached for her hand again, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, the complete unguardedness that she had been collecting since they met. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1886, a girl this time, with Sallie's coloring, and a temperament that revealed itself within the first weeks as one that was going to take no particular nonsense from anyone or anything, which both her parents found entirely satisfactory. They named her Eleanor for Sallie's mother, and Sallie Talbot came out from Ohio this time without the cautious ambivalence of her first visit, having been persuaded by 2 years of letters and 1 previous visit to Thomas that the life her daughter had built was genuine and good. Sallie Talbot held her granddaughter and sat in the kitchen of the house on Maple Street and looked at her daughter and son-in-law with an expression that was as close as she got to uncomplicated happiness. And she stayed for a month and went home on the eastbound, having decided that Kansas was not as alarming as she had originally assessed, and that the man her daughter had married was everything the first visit had suggested and possibly more. The years in Abilene built themselves the way good years do, not in dramatic accumulations, but in the steady increment of ordinary days that are, in total, extraordinary. Thomas started school in 1888 with strong opinions about arithmetic and a gift for reading that Sallie recognized as the family inheritance, and that his teacher, a careful man from Missouri, noted with approval. Young Aliner demonstrated an early inclination for the outdoors, and specifically for the horses that were the universal currency of the territory, and by the age of 4 was visiting the livery with her father with such frequency that the livery owner had begun to treat her as a regular customer and discuss the relative merits of various horses with her in a professional register she appeared to find appropriate. Samuel continued building federal cases through the late 1880s with the methodical momentum of a career that was doing what it was designed to do. Garrison Cole was released from federal prison in 1889 after serving his sentence and was reported to have moved to Missouri, where he had no apparent interest in resuming the kind of operations that had landed him in the federal penitentiary, which was the best outcome available and, as Samuel noted, actually more than he had expected from the man. Gordon Avery retired from the federal marshaling service in 1890 and was replaced by a younger man from Ohio who had heard of Samuel McCrae's record and had the intelligence to ask him to explain it rather than to reinvent the wheel. And the professional relationship that developed was built on mutual respect and continued to produce the results that both men were working toward. The question of Sallie's professional status came to a head in 1891, in a way that was both frustrating and ultimately productive. Preston Webb, their old Caldwell attorney, came through Abilene on legal business and had dinner with them, and told Sallie flatly that if the bar examination were open to women, she would have been practicing law for a decade by now, and that the frontier bar was being slow about it, but the direction was clear. Harriet Cross, Sallie's employer and colleague, was in correspondence with a network of women in the eastern states who were pushing this question through professional channels, and Sallie joined this correspondence network and contributed to it with the same organized attention she brought to everything, and found in it a satisfaction that was not about her individual situation, but about the principle of it, which was Thomas's principle, which was her own principle, which was the same principle that had sat her down in a marshal's office without waiting to be invited, the principle that says the truth of a thing matters more than the convention about it, and that you work toward the right outcome even when the process is slow. In the years they lived in Abilene, their marriage deepened in the way that marriages deepen when they are real, which is to say it became less about the discovery of new things and more about the richness that comes from knowing the same things at greater depth. They had fights, because two people with strong principles and direct communication styles will have fights, and their fights were always about things that mattered rather than about the surface of things, and they resolved them with the same honesty they brought to everything else, which meant they always came out the other side having understood something they had not understood before. This was not a small thing. It was, Sallie thought, possibly the most important thing. Samuel remained the man she had identified in the first hours, careful and perceptive and quietly funny, and committed to justice with a depth that was not professional but personal. He remained a man who made coffee before she was up and held the difficult facts still and steady, rather than avoiding them, and looked at her, years into the marriage, in the way that her mother had identified as the way her father looked at her mother. Sallie remained the woman he had identified sitting in the chair across his desk, honest and precise and courageous in the specific way that is not about the absence of fear, but about the decision to proceed honestly despite it. She remained a woman with opinions about everything, and a laugh that was a gift when it arrived, and a grief in the back room of herself that had not dissolved, but had become something she had found a way to carry that did not cost her everything. Thomas Talbot's name was included in the official federal record of the Cole prosecution, and when a Kansas territorial history was written in 1893 by a Topeka journalist who interviewed Samuel and Sallie both, it included a full account of the investigation and Thomas's role in it, and described Sallie's contribution with a specificity that she found satisfying not because of the recognition, but because it was accurate. The Caldwell chapter of their lives stayed with them the way formative things stay, not as nostalgia, but as substance. Clara Foss wrote twice a year, and came to visit Abilene in 1892 with the air of someone who had earned the trip and knew it. And she and Sallie sat in the kitchen on Maple Street and talked for 3 days with the pleasure of women who have been through the same difficult thing and come out friends on the other side of it. Hector Loon became the Marshal of Caldwell after Samuel left, and ran the position with competent steadiness for a decade before retiring to his farm outside town. And he and Maria visited Abilene when they could, and the Sunday dinner tradition, suspended by geography, resumed on these visits with its full warmth and Maria's excellent cooking. In 1895, the bar examination in Kansas opened to women by territorial ruling, which was the first state or territory to do so in that particular manner, and Harriet Cross sat the examination and passed it and became the first licensed female attorney in Abilene. And the party that followed at her office was the most satisfying professional event Sallie had attended, and she told Harriet directly that it was only a matter of time before she sat the examination herself. And Harriet told her it was only a matter of which year she chose. Sallie sat the bar examination in 1896 and passed it on the first attempt, which she had expected, and which pleased her nevertheless with the clean satisfaction of a thing done that she had been working toward for a long time, and in the direction of which she had been moving. She now understood, since the day she sat down in a chair without waiting to be invited. Samuel came home the evening she received the results, and she told him across the kitchen table, and he looked at her with the complete unguardedness of his important moments and said, "It was always a question of when." And she said, "Yes, I know." And he got up from the table and came around to her, and she stood up and he put his arms around her with the specific certainty that was his physical language for the things he felt most completely. And she held on to him, and they stood in the kitchen in the Abilene evening light for a while in the silence that is not empty but full. Thomas McCrae, who was 12 in 1895, was a boy who had inherited his mother's precision and his father's steadiness, and was beginning to develop the specific combination of those two qualities into something that was entirely his own. He had decided, with the directness that was clearly a family trait, that he intended to read law, and had said so to both his parents without apparent concern about their reception of the announcement, which was well-founded because their reception was immediate and enthusiastic. Eleanor McCrae, who was 9, had decided that she was going to work with horses professionally, which in 1895 was a somewhat unconventional aspiration for a girl, and which her parents addressed with the same principle that had governed most of their decisions, which was to treat the aspiration as real and to help her work toward it rather than to accommodate convention. The life they had in Abilene was the life they had built, and it was real and full and specific to them, and it had been built from two people with strong principles and direct communication, and the same understanding of justice, and a decision made in the cool spring air of a Kansas evening, when one of them said, "I want you to stay," and the other said, "That is very much a yes." Sallie Talbot McCrae practiced law in Abilene for the remainder of her career, and was known in the federal territory as a meticulous and effective advocate, whose manner was direct to the point of being disconcerting to attorneys who were accustomed to something more navigable, and whose record was built on the same foundation she had established when she was 24 and walked into a marshal's office with a dangerous book and put it on a stranger's desk, because she had decided that thin trust was better than no trust, and that the right side of a thing was the side worth being on. Samuel McCrae served as a federal marshal for the Northern Kansas Territory until 1901, when he transitioned to an advisory role with the federal office that allowed him to pass on 2 decades of operational experience to the next generation of lawmen, which he did with the same direct teaching style that he brought to everything, and which the younger marshals found alternately illuminating and challenging in the productive way. He retained, through the years, the capacity for stillness that had been his professional signature, and he retained the coffee before she was up habit, which over 20 years became one of the small specific things that Sallie thought she would miss more than anything dramatic if she ever had to. They sat on the porch of the house on Maple Street in Abilene in the evening of their later years and talked about what they had seen and done, and what was still in front of them. And sometimes one of them would mention Thomas with the easy tenderness that grief becomes over time when it has been carried honestly. And sometimes they would talk about Caldwell and ride down that street again in their minds, the morning light and the still faces, and the badge catching the sun, and 2 people on horses choosing, in front of everyone and everything, exactly who they were and who they were choosing. And sometimes they sat without talking at all in the prairie evening, which was the best kind of conversation they had ever learned to have, the one that required nothing but the willingness to be completely present with the person beside you, and in which everything that needed to be said was already understood so thoroughly that it lived not in words but in the simple and total fact of remaining, deliberately and completely, beside each other. That was what it had always been about: the riding down the main street, the sitting on the steps, the hand taken in the lamplight, the coffee left in the morning, the decision made on a westbound train when the world outside was gold and enormous and entirely available. It was about being beside, not behind, not at a polite remove, beside, which was the only place either of them had ever found where everything else made any sense at all.